Hello everybody and welcome to yet another Social Blueprint interview. Friends, we are at one of those great times of year in the Hebrew calendar, and that is Pesach time. That's right. And although all periods of the year are special in their own way, I certainly think, at least for me, Pesach time is one of the highlights of the calendar. And specifically today, I'm joined by Rabbi Yaakov Glasman AM. And what I really want to discuss is the old and the new and breaking out of Mitzrayim, or better known as Egypt maybe, from a few thousand years ago, and bringing it all the way into 5783 in the Hebrew calendar, or 2023, which is how do we break out of our own Mitzrayim? And here to talk about it, Rabbi, welcome.
Thank you so much, and thanks for having me on your wonderful program. I love the Social Blueprint, and I look at it every week, and I upload all of our events there every week because it's a great networking opportunity and connecting so many disparate parts of the community. So thank you for giving me this opportunity. And in answer to your question, I think the question of exiting Egypt is probably one of the most timeless questions. We find it straight in the Haggadah, which we're going to read in just 1 week's time. We're going to sit around the Seder table on Wednesday night and we're going to say, B'chol dor vador, in every generation, chayav adam lirot atzmo, every single Jewish person is obligated to view themselves ki'ilu yatzam mitzrayim, as if they themselves left Egypt. And the obvious question, as you've put is, we didn't leave Egypt. Our ancestors 3,500 years ago left Egypt. We live in Melbourne, Australia. We're not enslaved, but obviously the verse is alluding to something deeper. It's a spiritual exodus.
Right.
And, you know, the etymology of the Hebrew word Mitzrayim, or ancient Egypt, comes from the word Meitzar, which means a boundary, a constriction. We all live and operate in our lives with a certain spiritual boundary. We feel perhaps inhibited to express ourselves spiritually, to connect to our ancient traditions, and exiting Egypt, Yetziat Mitzrayim, leaving the boundaries, really means becoming more in touch with our inner self, with our core, with our spirituality, with our soul, and allowing ourselves to find expression in that through the ancient rituals of our faith that have been practiced and preserved for 3,500 years. So I think that's a contemporary modern spiritual take on exiting Egypt. It's each in our own world, exiting those confines and really connecting to our spiritual self.
For sure. Now, Rabbi, you're also a person of 2023, and you have had tremendous training in really what goes on between our ears. And focusing more deeply into this question of how do we break out of our own constraints? The how is what I want to know. Can you give us some tools maybe that you've learned? And it's not just, by the way, for Jewish people, it's for all people because we're all humans. What are some tools that you've learned how to get out of our own way?
It's a really interesting question. I think that different tools are going to work for different people, and what works for one person may not work for another. But some of the things that I found very helpful on this particular journey, the spiritual journey, is ever since I was about 17, I found a fascination in Jewish mysticism. We call it Kabbalah. I think Madonna made Kabbalah quite popular, but it was something that existed for many centuries before Madonna came on the scene.
For sure.
And Jewish mysticism, to me, talks very much about the soul of life. So, you know, Jewish law and the Talmud is very much about the body of the Torah, or the body of life. Do this, don't do that, say this, don't say that. And the Kabbalah, to me, talks about the soul of it. And it speaks about, really gives us a dissection of the soul, what makes it tick, what are its different characteristics. And the more we learn about the soul, the more in tune we become with the soul. And I think one of the tools how to exit, you know, our own self-confines.
Absolutely. I want to know.
So I think it's taking the timeless teachings of Jewish mysticism, which is accessible today. We can find many kosher proper websites that teach authentic Jewish mysticism today, or your local rabbi can teach it as well, or there are books on it, and to switch into it, because I think that the teachings of the Kabbalah are just as relevant in 2023 in Melbourne as they were in ancient Egypt or in biblical, you know, Eretz Israel, in Israel. So it's about studying the Kabbalah and putting some of its teachings into practice. I find that a really helpful tool.
Yes, and Rabbi, clearly you've spent a lot of time. You didn't just think up this answer off the top of your head. Can you just tell us a little bit about your training? Because you are certainly you've added a lot to your resume than just being a rabbi, so to speak.
Sure. So obviously, qualifying to become a rabbi means we have to learn rabbinic ordination. So this is a course of smicha where we are really learning Jewish law and how to apply the tenets of Jewish law and its principles to day-to-day scenarios as they arise, and it takes a lot of prerequisite Talmudic studies in order to achieve that. But I know a lot of people who study to become rabbis and don't actually practice as a rabbi. So a relative of mine, for example, got smicha, became a rabbi, and practices as an engineer for Telstra. And that's great, to each their own. But I strongly believe that nowadays the role of the rabbi has changed so much in the 21st century that just being ordained or qualified academically as a rabbi does not make the cut. I think it's critically important today for spiritual leaders to connect with their congregants through a more broad lens than just Torah studies, because although the Torah is the basis of our religion and of our community, we need to find different avenues through which to apply it. So personally, I've done a lot of training in the area of mental health. I've done a lot of short courses on counseling, grief counseling, and relationships counseling, and basic general counseling, and so on. And in that process, learned a lot about the basics of eye contact, voice modulation, body expression, and so on, and really about being present with the individual. We call it Rogerian style counseling.
Rogerian.
Yeah, well, it's named after a fellow named Carl Rogers, who was a famous psychologist, and he created this theme of client-centered counseling, where the counselor or the psychologist or what have you is really invested in the life of the client or the congregant or what have you, rather than coming in with their own set of ideas and beliefs. Leave it at the door, come in kind of like as an empty vessel with your clinical skills, and really listen to what the congregant may be saying, and apply those basic sort of skills of connecting with them. So I did a lot of training in that department over the years, but more recently, this was particularly during the COVID pandemic, when anyone who was involved in the mental health space knew that this pandemic was going to knock the country for a six, indeed around the world. The world, that's it. And I'm not going to obviously go into the debate about the lockdowns versus the cost of the mental health. That's something for experts to discuss, and will be discussed for years to come. But what I did know is that the community's mental health, individually and collectively, was going to take a hit. So I decided at the beginning of the pandemic, particularly when there weren't in-person services, to use the opportunity. I took 3 months of long service leave and began a master's degree in counseling at Monash University. And that process was incredibly informative. And the reason I did it is because basic counseling skills is one thing, but to learn some of the actual skills and techniques of counseling, whether it's cognitive behavioral therapy or many other various forms, I felt is really important if you want to be able to respond more professionally and more clinically to the mental health issues as they arise in the community. So I started that course during the pandemic, completed it just 2 months ago.
Amazing.
And it was a very enriching experience, and it wasn't an easy journey. It's a master's level, which obviously had a lot of work involved whilst working full time. Sacrificed my social life really for that, which was fine. And that's another area of training that I thoroughly invested myself into.
And do you feel that in your quote-unquote day job as a rabbi at St Kilda Shule, though, it's going to immeasurably help you? Because inevitably, I'm sure you get questions weekly about, Rabbi, what do I do with my life?
Yeah, undoubtedly. And it's actually a very interesting segue, the way you've worded your question, Rabbi, what do I do with my life? Because there is a very significant difference between a rabbinic pastoral role and a counseling role. Counselors are not allowed to tell patients or clients what to do with your life. We can explore feelings, we can explore options, but ultimately the client decides for themselves what they want to do.
Interesting.
Rabbis, on the other hand, are different. Rabbi means a teacher. Rabbis are actually encouraged to give advice and to say, do this, don't do that, etc. So one of the questions I always ask when I start a session with a congregant is, are you seeing me as a rabbi or are you seeing me as a counselor? Because wearing each of those hats will produce a different style of counseling. And I have to say, more often than not, they want to see me as a rabbi because I'm their rabbi, and that's fine. Yes. And then I use the skills that I've acquired through counseling to assist people in their world. So that's it's a fascinating interface between counseling, generic counseling as taught by the university, and rabbinic pastoral care, which is all about, Rabbi, what do I do?
And speaking of, if you don't mind me asking, I can't help but think it's a lot of pressure to put on you if someone says, what should I do with my life? And they actually may follow your instructions. Do you feel that pressure?
Well, first of all, that's why shuls all around will have actually indemnity insurance, if we're going to be very brutally honest, for that reason. But obviously, I always make sure to communicate to congregants when they see me in that capacity, that at the end of the day, it really is their decision. And I think it's not a healthy thing for a rabbi to actually, or anyone for that matter, to dictate to someone else how to live their lives. Yes. But I think that we can provide guidance, advice, and in line with the values of the traditions of our faith. And remember, if someone's knocking on my door or making an appointment, they want to see the rabbi, they're coming because they want rabbinic advice. They want to hear, what does religion have to say? What does our spiritual texts? So that's the angle that I'll take. Empower them to make their own decision, but not actually live through them. I think that's not a healthy thing.
Yeah, and I think that echoing that, taking it a step further, it's great advice for us parents out there as well.
I think as parents, the challenges of raising kids today is very different from yesteryear, so I hear exactly what you're saying,
I do want to ask your advice, though, on one matter that I think it is okay to talk about.
Sure.
Rabbi, you're an incredible public speaker. If anyone ever goes to any of Rabbi Glasman's bar mitzvah sermons, amazing way to connect with the kids. Any tips for us? Because you really do know how to light up the room.
Well, thank you for that. It shows me you weren't sleeping during the sermon, so that's great. I appreciate that.
Just before.
That's great. Look, St Kilda Shule is a very life cycle oriented shul, I have to say. We do a lot of bar mitzvahs and bat mitzvahs and weddings and things like that. The one thing I've always dreaded, particularly being in a large congregation, is becoming kind of monotonous and perfunctory, where you're just a number coming through a factory. So I make an active effort to get to know every bat mitzvah girl, every bar mitzvah boy, every couple before I marry them. And I'll actually have a series of meetings with the family in the lead up and take notes. I'll ask them questions. What footy team do you follow? What are your interests? What are your hobbies? What are your sports that you enjoy? What type of art do you do? And that's when you get a picture of every single child that comes through your doors. And the reason I do that is because when it comes to the sermon, I'm able to actually personalize it to the individual standing in front of me. So rather than just take this generic message from the Torah, say you're becoming bar or bat mitzvah, here's a message, go and live it. It's bringing the child's interests into it, find out a little bit about their family history, especially if there's this kind of intergenerational connection to the St Kilda Shule. Like sometimes you'll have bar mitzvah boys standing there, they're like 6th generation members of the shul, which is amazing, and trying to bring that in as well. So that's an answer to your question, really making an effort to get to know the boys. Our assistant Rabbi Hillel Nagel, who's a lovely guy, and myself, we teach the bar mitzvah classes weekly. We alternate, so we both develop and build a rapport with the boys. And we have an amazing bat mitzvah teacher who teaches the girls, and she involves me from time to time as well to get to know the girls. And that way you develop a rapport. In the year leading up to the bar mitzvah, when they're standing at the bimah, they're not just this random kid. It's someone you've actually gotten to know. And I cannot emphasize how important that is.
Yes, without a doubt, and that is a great words of advice for us, is do your homework beforehand.
Yeah, absolutely.
And speaking of that, one of the things that we're turning into a lighter subject even now, footy, Australian rules footy. Tell us about your passion.
Well, I always say this to the end of any talk, any interview, any public speaking engagement, because if I say it at the beginning, people tend to switch off. They've judged me already.
Oh, no.
I'm a very passionate Collingwood supporter. And people have often asked me, Yaakov, there's a stereotype about Collingwood supporters. They say, Yaakov, you've got no tattoos, your teeth are intact, you seem semi-intelligent. How did you get there? So, I'll often joke, I must have been, dropped on my head as a baby. It's the only explanation they'll accept. But the truth is that it's from my mother's side. My mother is a Glick, the Glick's Bakery. So that's
Yes.
that family. They've been Collingwood supporters forever. And, when you grow up in it, it just becomes part of your DNA. And I thoroughly enjoy the sport. I particularly enjoy going with my kids to the footy because there's very, very few games that we can actually attend. The Friday night ones and the Shabbat ones are out, obviously. Right. The Sunday ones is a very busy time for rabbis because we've got weddings and consecration. So it's very few Sundays of the year that I can take my kids to the footy. So we've booked for the Collingwood Sydney game because it's one during the Omer where there are no weddings. Okay. Super excited to do that with my son. And it's a passion. And a very quick story because this was like one of the highlights of my life. Yeah. One of the members of my congregation, also an avid Collingwood supporter, is very well connected to the board of the Collingwood Football Club.
I think I know who it is, but
okay, that's all right. I told him I wouldn't disclose his name in public because otherwise he'd be inundated with requests. Yes. Can you do this for us? He secured my son and I a team photo with the whole team. It was about 5 weeks ago, which was the most amazing experience. And I've got it on video because I didn't realize, but the person that connected us, that he connected with, a guy named Chris Tarrant, who used to play for the Pies, he was videoing my encounter with the team. And I didn't realize that. And he only sent it to me afterwards. And as we were waiting in line to have a photo with the team, we were sort of told, look, they've been standing there for an hour. It's their official team photo. They've done all the smiles. It's not a time to sort of engage in conversation or get signatures on your jerseys or take selfies. We weren't allowed to use our phones. It was just sort of in and out.
Right.
But as a rabbi, it's very difficult to just go in and out without saying something. So as I thought to myself in line, what am I going to say? What can I say? So as I was approaching this whole team, like all of my heroes, I just looked at the whole team and I just said for 3 seconds, I said, I'm a rabbi, I believe in heaven, and this is what it looks like, as a joke, right? And they loved it. They were clapping and cheering, and it was an amazing experience. Really looking forward to receiving the official photo, which hasn't yet come to us. So that was a big experience in my life.
What an amazing story. And I think it also talks about you as a person, which is you really, Rabbi, you do sit across what I call the religious world, the non-religious world. I believe you're the president of the Interfaith Society? Or you've written Interfaith Rules, is that correct?
Right, so when I was president of the Rabbinical Council of Victoria, so that's the State Rabbinical Council from 2009 to 2012, before becoming president of the National Council, which I'm currently presiding over, we undertook a project because we felt the important need of interfaith dialogue. But when you're engaging in interfaith dialogue, it does raise certain halachic issues, certain sensitivities of discussions of theology with other faith leaders and so on. So we created guidelines, official halachic guidelines that we distributed to all of our member rabbis. When you're engaging in interfaith dialogue, this is a good way to do it, which are diplomatic, but also halachically sound. And I had the amazing opportunity to meet with the then Premier of Victoria, Ted Baillieu. And he was really interested in this space. So I presented him the first official copy of the guidelines, and they became the first guidelines produced in that space anywhere in the country. So that was a really, really proud achievement for the team. It wasn't just me, it was the whole rabbinic team, and something that we've used, I've used it countless times in all of the interfaith work that I've done over those years.
Yeah, and it's incredibly important because, Rabbi, let's face it, right now, Jewish people in general, we're getting somewhat of a bad rap in the press. But the way to combat that, obviously, is through some type of dialogue to show people that we're human. Do you have any thoughts? Because, as I said, you have so much interaction with the secular world, if you will. Any words of advice of how to maybe handle things a little bit better?
I think so. Look, one point I would make is make the effort to engage with other people. Let's not live in a cloistered world, in a cocooned environment. It's really important to step out of our comfort zone. We spoke about exiting Egypt. Step out of the boundaries a little bit. Remain true to ourselves. Remain, very proudly and strongly Jewish, but based on the strength of our own Jewish identity, that empowers us to engage with other faith communities and to engage with them as well, build bridges instead of walls. And I do a lot of interfaith work in that space, and I would encourage others to do the same, because when we don't learn about other people or have them learn about us, it's too easy to fall into the trap of stereotyping that minority group based on whatever stereotypes exist.
Right.
The most common question I ask the 600 schools that visit the St Kilda Shule every year. It's a mammoth. I was just coming this morning. The Melton Christian College came to visit us, and on the other day I drove out to Springvale to do a talk to the text and tradition students at the Killister College in Springvale. Is how many of you have ever been into a shul, a synagogue? And invariably, no one will put their hand up. How many of you have ever met a rabbi? Invariably, no one will put their hand up. How many of you know people who might be Jewish? A few kids might put their hand up. And that tells me that we're doing important work.
Right.
Because when they walk in, they'll leave and they'll say, you know what, I've heard A, B, and C in my community or in society about the Jewish community, but my experience was very different. It was actually quite positive. And that's why I think the more we engage in dialogue, the better a society, the more cohesive and harmonious society in which we're going to live. And I think we can all be ambassadors. You don't have to be a rabbi to engage in dialogue with other people. It can be in your work environment, it can be in your social environment, in your sports environment, whatever it might be. There are ways to do it diplomatically, in a friendly way. Connect. It's a great thing for humanity to do.
Yes, no, I couldn't agree with you more, and those sound like really great pieces of advice. Rabbi, before we go, we're obviously pulling out of the COVID period right now, and as you said, you've done a lot of work in mental health. How does the shul fit into the mental health equation in your mind?
It's a really interesting question. Look, there's no doubt that from a religious point of view, a shul is a central focal point. It's important to come to a place of worship, to gather in prayer and so on. But putting the religious aspect to the side, there is so much data and research that points to people who are actively engaged in their faith community having just happier lives, higher levels of life happiness, of quality of life, a sense of belonging.
Yes.
When we talk about the Maslow chart, you've got your basic
hierarchy.
The hierarchy. So
yes.
The basic physiological needs. We all need a roof over our heads,
right.
and we need food in our tummies and so on. But not that far up is a sense of belonging, a sense of being part of something bigger. And I think that belonging to a shul community is a really good way of feeling that sense of belonging. Because, when you're not there for a couple of weeks, people start asking, where is so-and-so? I haven't seen her for a while. I haven't seen him for a while. People inquire, they call. And it makes a person feel like they matter. And also when engaged in the community dynamics, I think it makes people feel that they are contributing to something broader than just themselves. So I think coming out of COVID, particularly to respond to the mental health challenges that were inflicted on us because of the pandemic, the antidote to isolation is community. Yeah. And I think the focus is all on the community. So I encourage, obviously I think St Kilda Shule is a great place. It is. It's where I spend my waking hours and my sleeping hours as well sometimes.
Oh, God.
But whatever, wherever a person belongs, consider reconnecting if one isn't already feeling that connection in a palpable sense. Perhaps consider coming to shul, once a month rather than maybe once or twice a year, or once a week rather than once a month, and sensing that connection in the services, in the Kiddush time. I think that overall will enhance the mental health of those who attend the shul, and I think it's a very positive thing to do.
Yes, and in conclusion, Rabbi, firstly, thank you so much for your time, and for viewers out there, one thing we are blessed for in Melbourne especially is an amazing amount of events that go on in the community. And just head over to our website. You can see the events calendar. There's so much out there, especially this time of year. Yeah. But Rabbi, thank you so much. We really appreciate it. And if anyone wants to get in touch with Rabbi Glasman, we will make that available, and I really highly encourage it. Thank you very much, Rabbi.
Thank you so much, and Chag Sameach to everyone watching. Thank you.